Chapter 7. Moving. It was pandemonium. They had a big moving van and a people carrier. The van was already stuffed, mostly with baby stuff like push chairs and walkers. Kerry had 5 bags of clothes and junk, which James had to hump downstairs because her knee was still weak. Kyle, who was always ridiculously neat, wanted to take his clothes rail, 8 pairs of shoes, and his own ironing board. Ewart was going berserk, using language that would have earned James thousands of laps. "I'm only making 1 trip," Ewart shouted, "so you lot better sort yourselves out." James was the only one who'd followed instructions to pack light. He had a backpack with toiletries, spare trainers, a jacket, and a few changes of clothes. His PlayStation and TV had gone ahead the day before, with the furniture. Lauren came tearing around the corner towards them. She was in uniform, and she was crying. It was the last thing James expected. "What's the matter?" he asked, bundling his sister into his arms. Her t-shirt was sweaty, and the sobs made her whole body shudder. "Just," Lauren sniffed. James pulled her tighter and rubbed her back. "Is someone bullying you or something?" "I'm 10 in 2 weeks, she explained. "It's doing my head in thinking about basic training." Lauren acted tough most of the time, but she couldn't always keep the 9-year-old girl inside herself under control. Whenever there was a chink in her armour, she came to James for comfort. "Lauren, I passed training," James said, feeling a bit emotional himself. "I'd never done karate, and I could barely swim. With all the fitness and combat exercises you've done, you're a million times better prepared than I was." Lauren dragged her wrist over her eyes. Kerry got Lauren a tissue. "Come on, kids," Zara shouted as she climbed into the people carrier. "I want most of this drive out of the way before Joshua wakes up and starts screaming." "I wish you weren't going away," Lauren said. "Bethany's going into training with you," James said. "She'll probably be your partner. You two will do great." Lauren stepped back from James. Kerry gave her a quick squeeze. "Just think, Lauren," Kerry said. "In 4 months, basic training will be a memory and you'll be able to go on missions. I'll bet you. Any money you like." Lauren smiled a bit. "Yeah, I hope so." "If you want," James said, "I can probably arrange for you to visit us in Luton on your birthday. We can have a laugh." Lauren looked surprised. "Will they let me?" "They won't mind. It'll be good experience for you. Getting a taste of what it's like being out on a mission and stuff." "You better go then," Lauren sniffled, dabbing her eyes with the tissue. "I don't know what made me start crying. It's just... Sorry. I feel really dumb now." James pecked his sister on the cheek before saying goodbye and climbing in the back of the people carrier. Kyle leaned out of the side window. "You'll make it through training, Lauren," he shouted. "Don't go losing any sleep." James pulled up the door and buckled his seatbelt. "Sorry I shouted, James," Zara said from the driver's seat. "I didn't realise Lauren was upset. Is she okay?" "I think so," James nodded. Lauren waved as they drove away. James's eyes were a bit damp, but he wasn't worried. Lauren had a good brain, and she was fit. A serious injury was the only thing likely to stop her getting through basic training. Ewart and Nicole travelled in the moving van with the luggage. Zara drove the people carrier, with Kyle next to her in the front. James and Kerry sandwiched Joshua's baby seat in the back. The baby woke up an hour before they arrived. Kerry had a go at feeding him, but he screamed his head off. She passed him over to James while she hunted around her feet for a bottle Joshua had battered onto the floor. Joshua stopped screaming as soon as James took him. When Kerry tried to take Joshua back, he went nuts again. Kerry gave James the bottle, and Joshua began drinking calmly. "Looks like we found James's job for this mission," Zara said, grinning. "He likes you for some reason." Kyle laughed. Kerry probably traumatized him with the funny faces she was pulling the other afternoon. James wasn't used to babies. He was terrified he might do something wrong and either hurt Joshua or get puked over. It turned out okay, apart from a few dribbles of milk. After feeding, Joshua lay quietly in James's lap playing with the laces on his shorts. Once James got used to it, he thought having the warm little body wriggling on his lap was quite cool. A third of the houses on the Thornton estate were boarded up. The detached homes looked decent enough, but nobody wanted to live in them because of the airport a kilometre south. Every few minutes, a couple of hundred people thundered overhead, shaking the ground and filling the air with the sickly smell of jet fuel. You only ended up living on Thornton if you didn't have a choice. The residents were a mix of refugees, students, ex-convicts, and families who'd been chucked out of better places for not paying the rent. A gang of lads had to stop their football match to let Zara drive through. Ewan and Nicole had arrived minutes earlier. Nicole had unpacked the mugs and started making tea. The windows in the house were triple glazed to keep out the aircraft noise, but that didn't stop everything vibrating. Besides, it was too warm to leave every window closed. There were 3 bedrooms between 7 people. Kyle and James got a box room with bunk beds, a chest of drawers, and a tiny wardrobe. Just like old times, James said, remembering when he and Kyle shared a room in a council home before he joined CHERUB. "Oh, there's nowhere to hang my clothes," Kyle said miserably. "They'll get creased." "You can have the whole wardrobe," James said. "I'll just dump my stuff in the bag or under the bed." "If there's anything that stinks in this room, I'm chucking it out," Kyle said. "I don't care if it's a sock or a 70 quid pair of trainers. If it smells like you, it's going in the bin." James laughed. "Oh, I'd forgotten what a complete tart you are." Zara made dinner for everyone. Fish fingers and oven chips with frozen peas. "Sorry," she said, handing plates to the line of kids in front of the TV. "You better get used to my cooking. It's not exactly gourmet." Something crashed outside the living room window. All the kids downed cutlery and bundled towards the window. There was rubbish all over the front lawn and a metal dustbin rolling towards the gutter. A couple of boys were sprinting off down the pavement. Hewitt burst out of the front door, but they disappeared up an alleyway. As James mopped his last chip through his ketchup, Hewitt strode in and switched off the TV. "Hey, I always watch Neighbours," Kerry gasped. "Not today you don't," Hewitt said. "You kids have a job to do." "Go outside and start making friends," Zara said. "There's bound to be some dodgy characters in an area like this, so stick together. I want you back here as soon as it gets dark." "And James," Hewitt said, "you better pick all that rubbish off the front lawn before you go." "Why is it my job?" James said bitterly. Hewitt broke into a smile. "Because I said so." James thought about starting a row, but you never win against someone like Hewitt. It was easy starting conversations. The summer holidays had dragged on for weeks, and the local kids were bored. James and Kyle played street football until they got knackered. Kerry and Nicole stood by the curb, nattering with a bunch of girls. When it started getting late, the 4 of them got invited to a kiddies' playground. There was nothing special about it. A burned-out park keeper's shed sprayed with graffiti, a busted roundabout, a climbing frame, and a slide. But once the sun started to go down, it came alive. Kids aged between 10 and 16 gathered in 4s and 5s, smoking, arguing, and being loud. There was a tense atmosphere. Flash kids dressed like Nike commercials ripped into refugees dressed out of the charity box. Boys were trying to get off with girls, and there was a rumour going around about a gang from another estate turning up and starting a fight. Apparently, a kid had been stabbed in the playground a couple of months earlier. He'd ended up with between 8 and 200 stitches, depending on what version of the story you believed. "This is boring," Kerry said, after half an hour of standing around without anything happening except a lot of talk. "We better go home." "You go if you want," James said. "I'm staying to see if a fight breaks out. It might be good." "It might also be dangerous," Kerry said. "I've seen a couple of kids with knives, and Zara told us to be home before." James interrupted, mocking Kerry's voice. "Zara told us da-de-da. Chill out, Kerry. What's the point having a curfew unless you're going to break it?" Kerry looked at Nicole for moral support. "Are you coming?" "No way," Nicole said. "I want to see some action." They all waited another 20 minutes. A guy aged about 15 came over and started chatting up Nicole. Then someone's mobile rang and a rumour shot around. There was a car coming. So what? Kerry asked. Stolen car, one of the local kids explained. Joyriders. They usually put on a good show. 50-odd kids piled out of the playground and hurried to a deserted car park a few hundred metres down the road. A cheer went up when everyone spotted the headlights. It was a Subaru Impreza Turbo, metallic silver with a giant wing on the back. The driver did a couple of handbrake turns, spinning the car and stinking up the air with tyre smoke. Then he overdid it and smacked into a bollard, leaving a massive graze down one side of the car. The audience whooped and cheered, even though he'd nearly splattered a couple of girls standing astride their bikes. These guys are nutters, James giggled. I'd love to have a go at that. Kerry gave him a filthy look. It's so stupid. They could kill themselves, or an innocent bystander. Loosen up, Kerry, James said. You sound like an old fart. The Subaru squealed to a halt a few metres away. As the cloud of tyre smoke cleared, the driver and his mate opened the doors and ran around the car to switch seats. They both looked about 15. Where are our babes? The new driver shouted. A couple of tarty-looking girls jogged to the car and clambered in the back. When they were inside, the driver lit up the rear tyres and started driving circuits around the estate. He skidded on every corner, nearly losing the back end a couple of times on sharp turns. When the car was out of sight, you could still hear the engine and squealing tyres. The joyriders kept coming back to the car park for more adulation from their audience. The excitement level went into overload when a police siren went off. James was hoping to see a chase, but the joyriders didn't fancy their chances. They slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and merged into the crowd of kids as 3 police cars turned into the car park. Everyone started running. One of the guys they'd been playing football with tugged James by his t-shirt. Don't stand there gawping, he said urgently. The pigs will bust you if they get a hold of you. Kerry, Kyle and Nicole were already gone. James sprinted off, but the whole of Thornton estate looked identical in the dark and he couldn't remember the way home. He ended up in the centre of the estate, in a large paved square with lanes of identical houses branching off in 6 different directions. You know which way? A voice asked breathlessly. James spun around. It was a massive relief to see Kyle. Kerry and Nicole were with him. We can ask one of the policemen, Kerry said. Are you totally brain dead? James asked, tapping his head. The police are looking for 2 boys and 2 girls. They'll nick us. Kerry looked perplexed. But we didn't steal the car. Kerry, Kyle said, laughing. How naive are you? In an area like this, cops and kids are like oil and water. They don't mix. Well, Kerry said indignantly, none of this would have happened if we'd gone home when I said. Oh, shut your smug hole, James said. So, which way? Nicole asked. They were all out of breath when they burst through the front door. It was pure luck finding the right street at the second attempt, without bumping into any cops. Zara leaned out of the kitchen into the hallway. Ah, here they are, my little monsters, Zara grinned. Late as usual. The kids were expecting a roasting, but they got off because there was an old couple sitting at the table in the kitchen, drinking tea with Zara and Hewitt. This is the adopted family, Hewitt explained. Kids, meet Ron and Georgina. They live next door, and they brought us homemade biscuits to welcome us to the neighbourhood. You kids dip in, the old girl said. My biscuits have won prizes. They stuck their hands in the tin and grabbed one. They tasted like they'd been baked in 1937, but they could hardly start gobbing them out in front of the old lady. Delicious, James said, gagging for some water to get the stale taste out of his mouth. Would you like another one? The old dear asked. Zara clamped the lid on the biscuit tin. They're off to their rooms now, Zara said. They're not really allowed sweet stuff this late. It's bad for their teeth. They were all thankful that Zara had saved them from another biscuit. James led the scramble upstairs to the bathroom. Shh, you lot, Zara whispered after them. Joshua's asleep. The 4 of them queued at the bathroom tap to get a drink. Then they slugged mouthwash to get the taste out of their mouths. It's like a single bite sucks every bit of saliva out of your mouth, Kerry said. I bet she knows how disgusting they are, Kyle said. Probably gets a kick out of watching everyone suffer. Hope the old bag dies, Nicole said. James started laughing. All right, I think that's a tiny bit extreme, Nicole. I can't stand old people, Nicole said. Wait till they're 60, then give all of them both barrels of a shotgun. My nan was great, James said. I got a Kit Kat or a wagon wheel every time I saw her. I was her favourite. She never liked Lauren much. Kerry grunted. No accounting for taste, I suppose. When did she die? When I was 10. Is Lauren okay now? Kyle asked. I haven't spoken to her since this morning, James said. Suppose I'd better ring her before I go to bed. After he'd undressed, James climbed into his bunk and gave Lauren a call on his mobile. She was embarrassed about crying earlier and didn't want to talk about it. Chapter 8. Contact. It was the first day of a new school year. The lines of miserable kids had short haircuts and new uniforms to grow into. Kyle offered to run the iron over James's stuff to make it nice and crisp, as he put it. James had forgotten how annoying it was to wear a tie and blazer all day. The only good thing was, Nicole looked fit in her white blouse, with her tie loose around the collar. She'd altered her skirt so it was half the length of Kerry's. James had been to a few different schools since his mum died. Grey Park looked like it was at the bottom of the pile. The smell was a mixture of toilets and floor polish. The curtains and walls in the entrance hall were stuck up with thousands of bits of chewing gum. Half the kids weren't in uniform, and there was an aquarium full of dead fish with a chair floating in it. James broke off from the others and found his classroom. He recognised Junior Moore straight away, sitting at the back with a mate. You could tell, by the state of their uniforms and the way they were sitting with their trainers on the desk, that they wanted everyone to think they were bad guys. James had to work his way in with them gradually. If you went straight up and introduced yourself to kids like that, they'd treat you like a joke. James's plan was to act cool and win them over with bad behaviour. The teacher came in. He was a titchy little donut in a beige suit called Mr. Sean. He seemed full of himself. The kind of teacher who gave you an urge to muck about, just so you got the pleasure of seeing him flip out. Okay, Mr. Sean shouted, slamming a book on his desk to get everyone's attention. Summer is over. Welcome to Year 8. Find your seats and settle down. James sat at an empty desk in the middle. This seriously weird kid sat next to him. He was tall, but stick-thin. His uniform was too small, and his walk was bizarre, like he was trying to move in 20 directions at once. You're new, the weirdo said. I'm Charles. James didn't want to be nasty, but a geeky pal was the last thing he needed if he was going to make friends with Junior. I can show you around if you want, Charles said. It's okay, James replied awkwardly. I'll manage, but cheers for the offer. Charles didn't carry a backpack like the other kids. He had a brown leather briefcase. Judging by the noise when he put it down, he kept a couple of bricks inside. Charles stooped over the desk and began frantically scratching at the back of his hand. A snowstorm of skin flakes drifted onto the table in front of him. I've got eczema, Charles explained noisily. It gets worse in the summer when I sweat. Mr. Sean started handing out timetables and burbling about the fabulous opportunities presented by the after-school chess and drama clubs. 10 minutes into school, James already wanted to burst out of the front gate and run for the hills. He'd always found school boring, but after being at CHERUB, where the classes were small and the teachers pushed you, normal school made him feel like his life was running in slow motion. Charles was bored as well. He got an apple out of his briefcase and crunched into it. Mr. Sean stopped talking and glowered at him. Charles, what on earth are you doing? Eating an apple? Charles said, as if he'd been asked the world's stupidest question. We don't eat in class, do we? Mr. Sean said. Everyone started laughing. If a cool kid had bitten the apple, they would have laughed at how funny it was. But they all had Charles down as class loser, so everyone was shaking their heads, and there were a few murmurs of spastic and retard. Put it in the bin, Charles. Charles took a final bite of the apple before hurling it at the metal bin behind Mr. Sean's desk. He missed, so he lumbered over and picked it off the floor. The back of his trousers looked set to rip open when he bent down, and you could see his bright green Y-fronts. "Nice knickers, Charles," one of the girls shouted. "Yeah," someone else shouted, "but they were white when he put them on." The kids went into another round of laughs. Charles missed the bin a second time, even though he was dropping the apple from less than a metre. He lost his temper and kicked out. The bin smashed against the wall and the metal got bent out of shape. "Charles, calm down," Mr. Sean shouted. "I hate bins," Charles steamed, booting it again. "Into your seat now, Charles, unless you want a detention tonight." Charles stumbled back to his seat. Their maths teacher was a fruitcake. She had the key for the wrong classroom. Everyone stood around in the corridor while she went looking for the caretaker. Junior and his pal wandered up to Charles. James was standing next to him. "Did you miss us this summer?" Junior asked. Charles kept quiet. Junior grabbed his wrist and bent back his thumb. "Did you bring us any presents from your holiday?" Junior asked, tightening his grip until Charles's face twisted up in pain. "No," Charles gasped. "That's not nice. I think you deserve a slap." Junior let Charles's thumb go and clocked him around the face. It wasn't hard. It was mainly done for humiliation. "And who's your new friend?" Junior asked. James, Charles stuttered. Junior faced James off. He was a fair bit shorter than James, but he had beefy arms and shoulders, as well as a mate to back him up. He gave James a little shove. James felt edgy. CHERUB training had taught him that your first encounter with someone sets the tone for everything that follows. If James appeared weak, Junior would never consider him an equal, and they'd be unlikely to make friends. But if James lashed out, they might become enemies, and that would be even worse. He had to get the right balance between the two. "Oh, try pushing me around if you want to," James said casually, "but I wouldn't recommend it." Junior turned to his mate and smiled. "What's this, Dell?" he laughed. "Looks like the new boy thinks he's a hard man." Junior tried to grab James's wrist. James dodged out of the way and jabbed 2 fingers into Junior's belly, sending him into a spasm. "Oh, too slow," James said, shaking his head in contempt. Junior lunged again. His fist hit James in the guts, knocking the wind out of him. The force behind it surprised James. In a flash of anger, he hooked his foot around Junior's ankle and shoved him over. All the other kids backed up, expecting a fight. James stood over Junior with his fists bunched, defying him to get up. Junior didn't look too confident. After a couple of tense moments, James smiled and reached out his hand. "If you want a row, there's plenty of easier targets around than me," he said. Junior looked pissed off, but grudgingly let James help him up. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Junior asked, brushing off his uniform. "From Zara, my stepmom," James said. "She's a karate instructor." "Cool," Junior said. "What belt are you?" "Black, of course," James said. "What about you? Who taught you to throw a punch?" "Boxing club," Junior said. "I'm undefeated. 8 fights, 8 victories." By the time the teacher got the classroom door open, the lesson was half finished. There was a spare seat next to Junior. "Mind if I sit here?" James asked. "Free country," Junior shrugged. "This is Dell, and I'm Keith, but that's my dad's name, so everyone calls me Junior." "I'm James. Thanks for rescuing us from sitting with Freak Boy over there." James was pleased with himself. It had only taken an hour to break the ice. He sealed the deal by blowing a massive raspberry when the teacher asked him to be quiet. Junior and Dell cracked up laughing. Junior slapped James on the back as they walked out to morning break. "You've got bottled, James," he said. "What lesson's next?" Dell got a timetable out of his pocket. "History," he said. "Balls to that," Junior said. "What about this afternoon?" "Maths and French." "Nah, I don't fancy that," Junior said. "You coming, Dell?" Dell looked anxious. I don't know. I don't think we should bunk off first day. My dad's going to kill me if we get suspended again." "Well," Junior said, "it's sunny outside. There's no way I'm sitting cooped up in some classroom. You want to tag along, James? Where are you going? God knows. We can get burgers or something. Hang around the shopping centre. Whatever, James said. Anything beats lessons. One of the coolest things about missions was being able to break all the rules without getting into trouble. The two boys crawled around the back gate and ran a couple of 100 metres away from the school. Junior did a strip. He had a Puma t-shirt and shorts under his uniform. If you're going to bunk off, Junior explained, it's best to get rid of the uniform. Otherwise you get some old bats spotting the badge on your blazer and ringing up your school to complain. Smart, James nodded. But all I've got under here is bare skin, so unless you want me to walk around in my boxers, I'm stuck with it. You want to go to the Reef Centre? Junior asked. What's that? Big shopping place. You're seriously telling me you've never been there? We only moved here a week ago, James explained. Why's that? We were in London, James lied, repeating the cover story that they'd all had to memorise. My stepdad got a job at the airport, so we moved up here. If you've never been to the Reef Centre, we should definitely go. It's half an hour on the bus. There's sports shops, game shops, and a big food court. Sounds cool, James said, but I've only got the £3 Zara gave me to buy lunch. I can lend you a £5, James, but I'll send my geezers round to smash your legs if you don't pay me back. James laughed. Cheers.